The altimeter is spinning backward like a broken clock, numbers tumbling through 38,000 feet, 37,000, 36,000. I am not there in that cockpit, but as I sit here in my study, thousands of miles away, with these investigation documents spread across my mahogany desk, I can feel the cold dread that must have gripped the heart of Captain Michael Brennan in those final, desperate minutes. I can hear the mechanical symphony of warning tones competing for attention in a flight deck that has transformed from a sanctuary of precision into a chamber of horror. I can see his hands, those same hands that have guided metal birds safely through thunderstorms and turbulence for 20 years, now pounding uselessly against a reinforced door that refuses to yield. My name is Captain Paul Henderson. I have been flying commercial aircraft for over 25 years. I have logged more than 18,000 hours in the left seat of everything, from regional turboprops to wide-body international jets. I have seen engine failures at rotation, electrical fires at altitude, hydraulic system collapses over the ocean. I have guided crippled aircraft to emergency landings. I have held the controls steady when every instinct screamed to panic. But in all my years, in all the scenarios I have trained for, in all the emergencies I have studied and prepared for, nothing compares to what I'm about to share with you today. This is not a story about mechanical failure. This is not about weather or navigation error or maintenance oversight. This is about something far more terrifying, something that keeps me awake some nights even now. This is about the day a pilot became a weapon. Today I'm going to walk you through every second of what happened aboard TransContinental Airways Flight 8742, every decision, every action, every horrifying moment from departure to impact. This story will disturb you. It should disturb you, because what happened on that flight exposed cracks in our aviation safety system that nobody wanted to acknowledge, cracks that allowed 163 innocent people to die while a pilot sat calmly at the controls, breathing steadily, watching altitudes fall, listening to desperate screams from outside the cockpit door, and doing absolutely nothing to prevent what he knew was coming. Welcome aboard. We begin on a Tuesday morning, April 14th, 2016. The sun has barely cleared the horizon over Denver International Airport. The massive facility sprawls across 53 square miles of Colorado prairie, its distinctive white-peaked roof gleaming in the early light, like mountains made of fabric and steel. The airport is already alive with activity. Baggage handlers load cargo containers into holds. Fuel trucks maneuver between aircraft. Ground crews complete pre-flight checks. Inside the terminals, thousands of travelers move through security checkpoints, buy overpriced coffee, stare at departure boards, send final text messages before boarding. At Gate 33 in Concourse A, TransContinental Airways Flight 8742 is preparing for departure. The destination is Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, a routine 2-hour flight up the Western Corridor. The aircraft is a Boeing 737-800, registration number November 738 Tango. Charlie. She is 16 years old with 41,000 hours on her airframe. Her maintenance records are impeccable. Every inspection completed on schedule. Every service bulletin complied with. Every component tracked and logged. She is a reliable workhorse, the kind of aircraft pilots trust implicitly. There is nothing wrong with this airplane. The problem today will not be mechanical. 157 passengers are boarding through the jet bridge. They represent a cross-section of American life. There are business executives heading to meetings in Seattle, their laptops already open, reviewing presentations. There are families beginning spring vacation, children clutching stuffed animals and coloring books. There is a retired couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary with a trip to the Pacific Northwest. There are college students returning to campus after visiting home. There is a young woman traveling to see her sister, who has just given birth to her first child. There is a father who promised his daughter he would be home in time for her school play tomorrow evening. There is a woman who survived cancer and is traveling to thank the medical team who saved her life. They are ordinary people on an ordinary flight, thinking about meetings and vacations and family and work and all the small concerns that fill our daily lives. They board the aircraft, stow their bags in overhead bins, buckle their seatbelts, adjust their seats. Some pull out books, others plug in headphones. A few close their eyes, hoping to sleep through the flight. None of them know that they will never reach Seattle. None of them know that in less than 90 minutes, they will all be dead. In the flight deck, 2 pilots complete their pre-flight procedures. Captain Michael Brennan occupies the left seat. He is 42 years old, married with 3 children aged 14, 11, and 8. He coaches his son's little league team. He volunteers at his church. His wife teaches kindergarten. They live in a modest house in the suburbs with a golden retriever named Bailey. Captain Brennan has been flying for TransContinental Airways for 16 years. His total flight time is 9,200 hours. He has 7,000 hours in the Boeing 737. His training records show consistently excellent performance. His line check last month was flawless. His colleagues describe him as professional, calm under pressure, and meticulous about procedures. He is exactly the kind of pilot you want flying your aircraft. In the right seat sits First Officer Eric Dalton. He is 29 years old, single, lives alone in an apartment near the airport. He has been with TransContinental for 3 years. His total flight time is 1,400 hours, with 900 hours in the 737. On paper, he is a competent pilot. His technical skills are solid. He passed his type rating check ride on the first attempt. His simulator evaluations show adequate performance in emergency procedures. But behind that facade of competence, behind the pressed uniform and the professional demeanor, behind the confident voice on the radio, something is very, very wrong with First Officer Eric Dalton, and that wrongness, that sickness festering in his mind, is about to manifest in the most horrific way imaginable. Let me tell you about Eric Dalton, because understanding his story is essential to understanding what happens next. Eric grew up in a small town in Nebraska. Flying was not just his dream, it was his obsession, his identity, the only thing that gave his life meaning. As a child, he built model airplanes, covered his bedroom walls with aviation posters, spent hours watching aircraft take off and land at the local airport. At 16, he took his first flying lesson. At 17, he soloed. At 18, he earned his private pilot license. Flying was everything to him. It was who he was. He enrolled in a university aviation program, took out massive student loans to pay for flight training. The debt mounted quickly, $50,000, $70,000, $100,000. But he did not care. He was going to be an airline pilot. That was his destiny. Nothing else mattered. He graduated, earned his commercial license, his multi-engine rating, his flight instructor certificate. He worked as a flight instructor for 2 years, building hours, living in poverty, eating ramen noodles, sharing a tiny apartment with 3 other instructors. But it was worth it. He was building time, getting closer to the airlines, closer to his dream. In 2013, he was hired by a regional airline. 2 years later, TransContinental Airways hired him. He had made it. He was flying for a major carrier. The dream had come true. But then something began to change. The job was not what he had imagined. The schedule was brutal. He was away from home constantly. The pay, while better than instructing, barely covered his loan payments and living expenses. He was tired all the time. He had no social life, no relationships, no friends outside of work. Flying, the thing that had once brought him joy, had become just a job, a stressful, exhausting, isolating job. He developed insomnia. Some nights he would lie in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing, unable to shut down. He started taking over-the-counter sleep medications. When those stopped working, he found a doctor who prescribed something stronger. He began having headaches, severe migraines that would last for days. He saw multiple doctors. They ran tests. Everything came back normal. The headaches were stress-related, they said, psychosomatic. He needed to relax, to take time off, to see a therapist. But Eric could not take time off. He had bills to pay, loans to service. Missing work meant losing income. Losing income meant falling behind on payments. Falling behind meant financial ruin. So he kept flying. He kept showing up for trips, kept going through the motions, kept pretending everything was fine. In late 2015, his mental health deteriorated rapidly. He became convinced something was wrong with his vision. He would see spots, flashes of light, dark areas in his peripheral vision. He saw ophthalmologists, neurologists, went to emergency rooms convinced he was going blind. Every test came back normal. There was nothing wrong with his eyes. The problem, doctors told him, was anxiety, stress, psychological. One psychiatrist diagnosed him with severe anxiety disorder and depression. Another mentioned possible signs of obsessive-compulsive disorder. A third suggested he might be experiencing the early stages of a psychotic break. Medications were prescribed: antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, sleep aids. Eric filled the prescriptions but did not take them consistently. He was afraid of side effects, afraid the medications would impair his flying, afraid of what it meant to need psychiatric drugs. And here is where the system failed catastrophically. Every one of those doctors who saw Eric, who diagnosed him, who prescribed medications, who noted his deteriorating mental state in their records, every single one of them was bound by patient confidentiality laws. They could not, by law, contact his employer. They could not tell TransContinental Airways that one of their pilots was experiencing severe psychological problems. They could not warn anyone that Eric Dalton was unfit to fly. And Eric, for his part, said nothing. When he renewed his aviation medical certificate, the form asked if he had received any mental health treatment in the past year. He checked no. He lied. When his medical examiner asked if he was taking any medications, he said no. Another lie. He knew that if he told the truth, his medical certificate would be revoked. His career would be over. He would lose everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed for, everything he had gone into crushing debt for. So he lied, and he kept flying, and nobody with the authority to ground him knew that anything was wrong. In the weeks before April 14th, Eric's condition worsened dramatically. He barely slept. He stopped eating regularly. He lost weight. He looked gaunt, hollow-eyed, exhausted. Some of his colleagues noticed and asked if he was okay. He always said yes, just tired, just a rough week, nothing serious. Nobody pushed further. Nobody reported concerns to management. Nobody thought this tired, stressed pilot might be dangerous. And here is the detail that still sends chills down my spine when I think about it. Investigators later discovered that in the days before Flight 8742, Eric spent hours online researching cockpit door-locking mechanisms. He read technical manuals, he watched training videos, he studied emergency procedures. He learned exactly how the door-locking system worked, exactly what would happen if someone on the inside prevented access, exactly how long it would take for someone on the outside to override the lock. This was not idle curiosity. This was reconnaissance. This was planning. On the morning of April 14th, Eric woke in his apartment at 4:30. He had slept less than 3 hours. He showered, dressed in his uniform, grabbed his flight bag. He drove to the airport in darkness, listening to music, his face expressionless. He parked in the employee lot, rode the shuttle to the terminal, passed through security. He met Captain Brennan at the gate at 6:15. They exchanged greetings. Brennan asked how he was doing. Eric said fine, ready to go. His voice was calm. His hands were steady. He showed no outward signs of distress. They walked to the aircraft together, climbed the stairs to the flight deck, began their pre-flight checks. Everything proceeded normally. Eric was professional, methodical, competent. He programmed the flight management computer. He reviewed the weather. He calculated takeoff performance data. Captain Brennan, watching him work, noticed nothing unusual. This was just another day, just another flight, just another routine operation. The passengers finished boarding at 7:42. The main cabin door closed. The ground crew disconnected the jet bridge. At 7:48, Captain Brennan received pushback clearance from ramp control. The tug pushed them back from the gate. Engines started without incident. They received taxi clearance. Captain Brennan advanced the thrust levers. The 737 began rolling toward the departure runway. At 8:03, they lined up on runway 25. The tower cleared them for takeoff. Captain Brennan advanced the thrust levers to take off power. The engines roared. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, gaining speed rapidly. 100 knots, 120, 140. At 157 knots, Eric called rotate. Captain Brennan pulled back on the control column. The nose lifted. The main landing gear left the pavement. Flight 8742 was airborne. The departure was textbook perfect. The aircraft climbed smoothly through clear morning sky. At 1,000 feet, the landing gear retracted. At 3,000 feet, the flaps retracted. Eric, serving as pilot flying for this leg, followed the departure procedure precisely, executing turns exactly as published, maintaining assigned altitudes to the foot, communicating with air traffic control in clear professional tones. Everything was routine, everything was normal, but during the climb something happened that nobody understood at the time. Something subtle, something that only made sense later when investigators analyzed the flight data recorder. At one point during the climb, Captain Brennan left his seat briefly to retrieve a manual from a storage compartment in the back of the flight deck. He was gone for perhaps 20 seconds. During those 20 seconds, Eric reached forward and adjusted the altitude selector on the autopilot panel. He dialed it down to 5,000 feet, then immediately returned it to the assigned altitude of 35,000 feet. The aircraft continued climbing normally. Nothing changed. The brief adjustment had no effect on the flight path. Why did he do this? Investigators believe it was a test, a rehearsal. Eric was practicing, familiarizing himself with the controls, confirming what he had studied online, preparing for what he intended to do later. He was making sure he knew exactly how to execute his plan when the moment came. At 8:37, Flight 8742 reached its assigned cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The aircraft leveled off. The autopilot maintained heading and altitude. The ride was smooth. Below them, the Rocky Mountains stretched to the horizon, peaks still covered with snow, valleys filled with shadow. It was a beautiful morning. Visibility was unlimited. Weather radar showed clear skies ahead all the way to Seattle. In the cabin, passengers relaxed. Flight attendants began preparing the beverage service. Some people worked on laptops. Others read or watched movies on tablets. Children played games. The retired couple held hands and looked out the window at the mountains below. The young woman texted her sister that she would see her new niece in less than 2 hours. The father messaged his daughter that he would definitely make it home for her play. Everything was peaceful, routine, unremarkable. In the flight deck, Captain Brennan leaned back in his seat, allowing himself to relax slightly now that they were established in cruise. The flight from Denver to Seattle had been delayed on the ground due to late arriving aircraft, and they had pushed back 30 minutes behind schedule. Brennan had skipped his usual pre-flight coffee, rushing to complete checks and get the flight out. Now, with the aircraft stable at cruise altitude, he felt the pressure on his bladder becoming uncomfortable. "Things are looking good," he said to Eric. "Weather is perfect. Systems are all normal. I need to make a quick head call." "No problem," Eric replied. His voice was calm, steady, professional. "Take your time. I will review the arrival procedures while you are gone." "Sounds good. You have the aircraft." "I have the aircraft," Eric confirmed. Captain Brennan unbuckled his harness, stood, and stepped out of the flight deck. The heavy, reinforced door closed behind him with a solid thunk. The locking mechanism engaged automatically. And just like that, Eric Dalton was alone at the controls of a Boeing 737 with 162 people behind him, flying at 35,000 feet over the mountains of Wyoming. For perhaps 5 seconds, Eric simply sat motionless, staring straight ahead through the windscreen at the endless blue sky. Then, with movements that were slow and deliberate, he reached forward to the door control panel mounted on the center console. The panel had 3 positions: normal, unlock, and lock. In normal mode, anyone with the access code could open the door after a brief delay. In lock mode, the door could not be opened from outside under any circumstances. Eric moved the switch from normal to lock. The door was now sealed. Captain Brennan could not get back in. The flight attendants could not get in. Nobody could get in. Eric was locked inside the cockpit with complete control of the aircraft, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. He sat for another moment, breathing slowly, calmly. Then he reached forward again, this time to the autopilot mode control panel. He rotated the altitude selector counterclockwise, watching the numbers decrease. 30,000 feet, 20,000, 10,000. He continued turning until the display read 1,000 feet. Then he pressed the altitude select button, commanding the autopilot to descend to the new target altitude. The autopilot responded immediately. The auto throttle system reduced engine thrust to flight idle. The nose of the aircraft pitched downward slightly. The vertical speed indicator showed a descent rate of 2,000 feet per minute. The altimeter began unwinding. 34,000 feet, 33,000, 32,000. In the back of the flight deck, Captain Brennan finished in the lavatory and started back toward the cockpit. As he reached for the door, he noticed something that made him pause. The sound of the engines had changed. The steady drone of cruise power had dropped to a quieter idle thrust, and he could feel it in his inner ear, that subtle sensation of the aircraft's nose pitching down slightly. They were descending. That made no sense. They were supposed to be maintaining 35,000 feet. Air traffic control had not cleared them to descend. There was no reason to be descending. Brennan felt a flicker of concern. Maybe Eric had misheard a clearance. Maybe there was a pressurization problem requiring an emergency descent. Maybe there was an issue with the autopilot. He pressed the access code into the keypad on the door. 4 digits that would normally trigger a chime in the cockpit and allow entry after a few seconds. He waited, expecting to hear the electronic tone of the lock disengaging. Nothing happened. The door remained locked. Confused now, Brennan pressed the code again, more carefully this time, making sure he entered each digit correctly. Again, nothing. The door did not open. Inside the cockpit, a soft chime sounded, indicating someone was requesting entry. Eric glanced at the small video screen that showed the view from the camera mounted outside the door. He could see Captain Brennan standing there, his face creased with confusion. Eric looked at the screen for a moment, then looked away. He did not move to unlock the door. He simply sat, hands in his lap, watching the altimeter unwind. Outside, Brennan knocked on the door. "Eric, open up. I need to get back in." His voice was calm but firm. Still no response. He knocked again, harder this time. "Eric, can you hear me? Open the door." At 150 miles away, in the Air Traffic Control Center in Salt Lake City, a controller named Jennifer Martinez noticed something on her radar display that made her frown. Flight 8742, which should have been maintaining 35,000 feet, was showing 33,000 and descending. She had not cleared them to descend. She had not heard them request a lower altitude. She keyed her radio. "TransContinental 8742 Salt Lake Center. Verify maintaining flight level 350. Silence. In the cockpit, Eric heard the transmission clearly through his headset. He did not respond. He simply continued staring forward, watching the mountains far below gradually growing closer. Martinez tried again. "TransContinental 8742, Salt Lake Center, radio check." Still nothing. She checked her frequency. It was correct. She verified that her radio was working by contacting another aircraft. No problem there. She looked back at her display. Flight 8742 was now showing 31,000 feet, still descending at 2,000 feet per minute. Something was very wrong. At the cockpit door, Captain Brennan was no longer confused. He was alarmed. The aircraft was descending without clearance. His first officer was not responding to his knocks. The door would not open. Years of training and experience kicked in. His mind raced through possibilities. Had Eric suffered a medical emergency? A heart attack? A stroke? Was he unconscious? But if Eric was unconscious, the door should still open with the emergency access code. After September 11th, 2001, when reinforced cockpit doors became mandatory, an emergency access system was built in. If someone outside entered a special code, the door would automatically unlock after 30 seconds, unless someone inside manually overrode it. This was designed for exactly this situation, when a pilot might be incapacitated and unable to open the door. Brennan entered the emergency code. A small light on the keypad turned amber, indicating the 30-second countdown had begun. He counted in his head. 10 seconds, 20, 30. The light should turn green and the door should unlock. The light remained amber. The door stayed locked. Inside the cockpit, another chime sounded, louder this time, indicating the emergency access code had been entered. A warning light illuminated on the door panel, alerting the pilot inside that the door would automatically unlock in 30 seconds. But that pilot, if he was conscious and functioning, could prevent the door from unlocking by simply moving the door control switch to the lock position and holding it there. Which is exactly what Eric had already done. Brennan stood outside the door, his heart now pounding, his mind struggling to process what was happening. If the emergency code did not work, that meant someone inside was actively preventing access. That meant Eric was conscious, aware, and deliberately keeping him out. But why? What possible reason could there be? And then, with terrible clarity, Brennan understood. The descending aircraft. The locked door. The lack of response to radio calls or knocking. This was not an emergency. This was not an accident. This was intentional. "Eric!" Brennan shouted, pounding on the door with his fist. "Eric! Open this door right now! That is a direct order!" Nothing. He pounded again, harder, the sound reverberating through the narrow corridor. "Eric! Talk to me! What are you doing? Open the door!" Inside the cabin, the lead flight attendant heard the shouting and the pounding. She unbuckled her jump seat harness and moved forward toward the flight deck. As she approached, she saw Captain Brennan at the door, his face flushed, his fist hammering on the reinforced panel. "Captain, what is happening?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. "Get me the crash axe," Brennan said, not taking his eyes off the door. "Now." The flight attendant's eyes widened. The crash axe was an emergency tool stored in the cabin, designed for use in evacuation scenarios. It was not something any pilot ever wanted to need. "Captain, get it now." Brennan's voice was sharp, commanding. She ran back down the aisle, retrieved the red-handled axe from its mounting bracket, and brought it forward. By now, several passengers had noticed the commotion. They were watching with growing concern as their captain stood outside the locked cockpit door, holding an axe. Brennan gripped the axe, raised it, and swung it hard against the door. The blade struck with a tremendous crash that echoed through the cabin. The door, built to withstand bullets and explosives, barely dented. He swung again, and again. Each impact sent vibrations through the airframe, but had no effect on the door itself. It was designed to resist exactly this kind of attack. It was impenetrable. In the cockpit, the sound of the axe striking the door was loud, violent, impossible to ignore. Eric heard it. He did not react. He simply sat, breathing slowly and evenly, his gaze fixed on the altimeter as it continued its relentless descent through 26,000 feet. At Salt Lake Center, Jennifer Martinez had escalated the situation to her supervisor. Multiple controllers were now attempting to raise Flight 8742 on different frequencies. They tried the primary frequency. They tried the emergency frequency. They contacted other aircraft in the area and asked them to try making contact on air-to-air frequencies. Nothing worked. The aircraft continued descending, now passing through 24,000 feet, and there was no response from the flight deck. The supervisor made a decision. He picked up a direct phone line to the North American Aerospace Defense Command. Within minutes, 2 F-15 fighter jets were scrambled from Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, with orders to intercept and attempt visual contact with Flight 8742. In the cabin, panic was beginning to spread. Passengers could hear Captain Brennan shouting, could hear the axe striking the door, could see the fear in the faces of the flight attendants. Some pulled out their phones and started making calls, leaving voicemail messages for loved ones. Others sent text messages. "Something is wrong with our flight. I don't know what is happening. I love you." One passenger, a technology executive, opened his laptop and began typing an email describing what he was witnessing, thinking someone needed to document what was happening. The father, who had promised his daughter he would be home for her play, recorded a video message on his phone. His hands shook as he held the camera. "Sweetie, Daddy loves you so much. I am so proud of you. I am sorry I won't be there tonight. You're going to be amazing. I love you. I love your mother. Be good. Be brave." He sent the video and then put the phone away and closed his eyes. The retired couple held each other. They had survived 50 years together. They had raised 3 children, buried parents, weathered job losses and health scares, and all the challenges that 5 decades of marriage brings. They had planned to spend their golden years traveling, enjoying the life they had built. Now they simply held each other as the aircraft descended toward the mountains below. Eric adjusted the autopilot again. He dialed the target speed higher, commanding the aircraft to accelerate. The nose pitched down more steeply. The descent rate increased to 4,000 feet per minute. Through the windscreen, the mountains were no longer distant features on the horizon. They were close now, filling the view, individual peaks and ridges visible in sharp detail. At 18,000 feet, the cockpit warning systems activated. A computerized voice began repeating a message through the speakers. "Terrain ahead, terrain ahead, pull up, pull up." The terrain awareness and warning system had detected the mountains ahead and was commanding the pilots to climb immediately. The warning repeated every few seconds, urgent and insistent. Eric ignored it. He made no move to climb, no move to turn away from the mountains. He simply sat, hands in his lap, breathing steadily, watching the altimeter continue its descent. Outside the door, Captain Brennan had stopped swinging the axe. His arms ached. He was breathing hard. The door showed scratches and small dents, but remained intact. It was useless. He could not get through. He dropped the axe and pressed his face against the small window in the door, trying to see inside. Through the narrow view, he could see the back of Eric's head. Perfectly still, perfectly calm. "Eric, please," Brennan said, his voice breaking now, desperation replacing anger. Please, there are people on this airplane, families, children. Please do not do this. Whatever is wrong, we can fix it. Please, just let me in. We can talk about it, please." Eric did not turn around. He did not acknowledge the plea. He simply continued staring forward. The terrain warning intensified. "Pull up. Pull up. Too low terrain. Pull up, pull up." The voice was urgent now, almost frantic. The ground proximity warning system knew what was about to happen. It was screaming its warning, trying desperately to alert pilots who were not listening. At 12,000 feet, passengers looking out the windows could see the mountains in terrible detail. Snow-covered peaks, rocky cliff faces, forests of pine trees. They could see how close they were, how fast they were descending. Some screamed, some prayed, some simply stared, frozen in shock and disbelief. At 8,000 feet, the two F-15 fighters arrived. The lead pilot pulled alongside Flight 8742, close enough to see into the cockpit windows. He could see one person sitting in the right seat, motionless. He could see no one in the left seat. He reported what he saw to his ground controller. There was nothing he could do. He could not force the aircraft to climb. He could not shoot it down. He could only watch. At 5,000 feet, Captain Brennan made one final desperate attempt. He picked up the interphone handset and called the cockpit. The phone rang. He could hear it ringing through the door. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. Eric did not answer. At 3,000 feet, Brennan dropped the phone and pressed both hands against the door. Tears streamed down his face. "Please," he whispered. "Please, do not do this." At 1,000 feet, the terrain warning system reached maximum urgency. "Pull up now, pull up now, pull up now." The voice was continuous, desperate, begging for a response that would never come. At 8:51 and 43 seconds in the morning, traveling at 380 knots, descending at 5,000 feet per minute, TransContinental Airways Flight 8742 struck the western slope of Mount Henderson in the Wind River Range of Wyoming. The impact occurred at an elevation of 8,700 feet. The aircraft hit nose first at a 30-degree down angle. The force of the impact was so extreme that the airframe disintegrated instantly. The fuselage broke into thousands of pieces. The wings separated and tumbled down the mountainside. The engines tore free and carved massive gouges in the rock face. Fuel ignited, creating a fireball that consumed everything. 163 people died instantly. There were no survivors. There were no intact bodies. There was nothing left but scattered wreckage spread across half a mile of remote mountainside. The first emergency responders arrived by helicopter 40 minutes later. What they found defied description. Debris was scattered everywhere, none of it larger than a car. Personal belongings hung from trees. Luggage contents were strewn across rocks. The smell of jet fuel and burnt metal filled the air. There was nothing to rescue, no one to save. They could only document the scene and begin the terrible work of recovery. In the days and weeks that followed, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board descended on the crash site. They worked in difficult terrain, often in dangerous conditions, to recover every piece of evidence they could find. They found the flight data recorder embedded in rock 300 yards from the point of impact. They found the cockpit voice recorder crushed but still functional. They recovered both engines, portions of the flight control systems, fragments of the cockpit instruments, and slowly, painstakingly, they began to reconstruct what had happened. The cockpit voice recorder told the story in horrifying detail. The audio captured everything: Eric's calm breathing, Captain Brennan's increasingly desperate pleas, the sound of the axe striking the door, the terrain warnings, the passengers' screams in the final seconds, and through it all, Eric's steady, even breathing, never changing, never showing panic or fear or hesitation. Just breathing, calm and controlled, all the way to impact. The flight data recorder confirmed that every action during the descent had been deliberate. Eric had manually selected the low altitude. He had increased the descent rate. He had accelerated the aircraft. At no point did he attempt to level off or climb or turn away from the mountains. The data showed clear intent. This was not an accident. This was not confusion or error. This was murder. Investigators searched Eric's apartment. They found medications he had been prescribed, but had not taken. They found medical records showing psychiatric treatment he had never reported to his employer. They found his computer, and when they analyzed the browser history, they found searches for information about cockpit door systems, searches for mountain terrain in Wyoming, searches for suicide methods. They found a journal where he had written about his despair, his conviction that his life was over, his feeling that he had nothing left to lose. The investigation revealed systemic failures at every level. The medical system had failed because doctors were prevented by law from warning the airline about Eric's condition. The certification system had failed because it relied entirely on pilot honesty, with no mechanism to verify information. The airline had failed because it had no program to monitor pilot mental health between certification periods. The cockpit security system, designed to prevent terrorism, had created a vulnerability that allowed someone inside to lock everyone else out. In the aftermath of the tragedy, there was the enormous public outcry. Families demanded answers. Politicians held hearings. The media extensively analyzed every aspect of the disaster, and slowly, changes began to be implemented. The Federal Aviation Administration mandated new rules, requiring 2 people in the cockpit at all times. If a pilot left for any reason, a flight attendant had to enter. No one could be alone at the controls. Many airlines implemented this immediately. Some later quietly eliminated the requirement, arguing it created other safety concerns, but for a time it became standard practice. Mental health screening for pilots was enhanced. Airlines began requiring more frequent psychological evaluations. The stigma around pilots seeking mental health treatment began to slowly diminish. Programs were established allowing pilots to report psychological issues confidentially, without automatically losing their careers. The goal was to encourage pilots to get help, rather than hide problems out of fear. Medical certification procedures were reformed. The FAA established better information sharing between aviation medical examiners and treating physicians. While patient confidentiality remained important, mechanisms were created to flag concerning patterns without violating privacy laws. Random drug testing became more comprehensive, including screening for undisclosed psychiatric medications. Congress debated but ultimately did not pass legislation requiring remote takeover capability for commercial aircraft. The technology existed to allow ground controllers to take control of an aircraft remotely, but concerns about hacking and unintended consequences prevented implementation. Airlines improved their employee assistance programs, providing better access to mental health resources. Some established peer support networks where pilots could confidentially discuss stress, depression, or other issues with colleagues who understood the unique pressures of the profession. Financial assistance programs were created to help pilots dealing with debt, reducing one of the major stressors that prevented people from seeking help. Training programs were modified to include scenarios involving pilot incapacitation or intentional interference. Crews practiced procedures for dealing with locked cockpit doors. Discussions about mental health and psychological fitness became part of recurrent training. But perhaps the most important change was cultural. The aviation industry, which had always focused on mechanical safety and procedural compliance, began acknowledging that psychological fitness was just as critical as technical competency. The unspoken rule that pilots should never admit to stress or depression or anxiety began to erode. Slowly it became acceptable to say you were struggling, to ask for help, to take time away when needed. Of course, these changes came too late for the 163 people who died on Flight 8742, too late for the 16-year-old girl who never got to meet her niece, too late for the father who missed his daughter's play, too late for the couple who never completed their anniversary trip, too late for the cancer survivor who never got to thank her medical team, too late for Captain Michael Brennan, who spent his final moments desperately trying to save his passengers, but their deaths were not entirely in vain. The changes implemented after the crash have almost certainly prevented similar tragedies. Pilots struggling with depression or anxiety now have better options for getting help. Airlines have better systems for identifying at-risk individuals. The cockpit is no longer a place where one person can have unchecked control. The lessons learned from this disaster have made aviation safer. Still, I think about Flight 8742 often. I think about Captain Brennan standing outside that door, knowing exactly what was happening, unable to stop it. I think about the passengers in those final minutes, the terror they must have felt. I think about Eric Dalton and what drove him to that point. What combination of mental illness and despair and desperation led him to make such a horrific choice? And I think about how close any of us might be to that edge without realizing it. The aviation industry demands so much from its pilots. Long hours away from home, constant pressure to perform perfectly, the stress of being responsible for hundreds of lives, the financial burden of training costs, the physical toll of irregular schedules and jet lag. For most of us, we cope. We manage the stress. We maintain our mental health. But for some, it becomes too much. And when it does, we need systems in place to catch them before tragedy occurs. That is why I tell this story. Not to sensationalize a disaster or assign blame, but to remind everyone in aviation that safety is not just about checking systems and following procedures. Safety is also about taking care of the human beings who operate those systems and execute those procedures. It is about creating an environment where people can admit they are struggling without fear of losing everything. It is about recognizing that mental health is not a weakness or a flaw, but a medical condition that requires treatment, just like any physical illness. The family of Captain Michael Brennan established a foundation in his honor that provides mental health support and financial assistance to pilots dealing with depression, anxiety, or other psychological challenges. The foundation has helped hundreds of pilots get treatment they needed, treatment they might not have sought without that support. Michael Brennan was a hero who died trying to save his passengers. His legacy continues through the lives saved by the foundation bearing his name. I have been asked many times if the disaster has changed how I feel about flying. The answer is complicated. Aviation is still remarkably safe. Millions of flights operate every year without incident. The chances of being involved in a crash remain infinitesimally small. But I am more aware now of the human element, of the fact that every flight depends not just on properly maintained aircraft and well-designed systems, but on the mental and physical well-being of the people in the cockpit. When I sit in the left seat now, I pay attention to my colleagues differently than I used to. I notice if someone seems unusually quiet or stressed or distracted. I ask how people are doing, really doing, not just the automatic fine that we all default to. I try to create an environment where it is okay to not be okay, where admitting you are having a rough day is seen as responsible rather than weak, because that is what this tragedy taught us. Silence kills, stigma kills, fear of judgment kills, honesty, support, and compassion save lives. So to anyone reading this who is struggling, whether you are a pilot or work in any other field, please hear me. Asking for help is not weakness. Admitting you are overwhelmed is not failure. Taking time to address your mental health is not shameful. It is brave, it is responsible, it is necessary. And to those of you who work in aviation or any other safety-critical industry, please remember that your colleagues are human beings first and professionals second. Create space for people to be honest about their struggles. Support those who ask for help. Recognize that someone who admits they need time away is making the right decision, not letting anyone down. Flight 8742 should never have crashed. Eric Dalton should never have been in that cockpit that day. Captain Brennan should have been able to save his passengers. 163 people should have landed safely in Seattle, but they did not because systems failed, and a suffering man made a terrible choice, and now all we can do is learn from it and work to ensure it never happens again. The mountains of Wyoming still stand where they have always stood. The wreckage has been cleared away. Nature has reclaimed the impact site, but the memory remains. The names are remembered. The lessons endure. I am Captain Paul Henderson. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult story. I hope it has given you not just an understanding of what happened, but why it happened, and what we can do to prevent similar tragedies. Fly safe out there, take care of each other, and never hesitate to ask for help when you need it. Until next time, this is Captain Paul Henderson signing off.